Thanks, Joe. Good evening, everyone. You're really welcome here to the LGBTQIA plus History Club, which is held monthly. It's from the LGBTQIA plus Heritage Project, which is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and it's in partnership with the Linen Library. And my name's Michael. I'm one of the volunteers with the project, and I'm really delighted to welcome our guest speaker tonight, which is John O'Doherty. So I'm sure many of you will know John, who has been working for the Rainbow Project since 2008. He was the equality officer there and is currently the director. And he has also been involved in a number of different other initiatives. He was involved with the Love Equality campaign for equal marriage, and he's also co-chair of the Belfast Pride Committee. And John has a long history of campaigning for equality. And tonight we're delighted to hear a bit about the journey through some of those LGBTQIA campaigns in Northern Ireland, and that's John's topic tonight. So, John, over to you, and then after John speaks, we'll maybe have some time for discussion and questions. So, you're very welcome, John.
Thanks very much, Michael. It was news to me that we were being recorded and possibly going on YouTube. You have me questioning some of my statistics now, but we'll go through this. Thanks very much for the opportunity to come along and talk to the History Project tonight. I think the project's truly wonderful, and really the heartblood of this entire project is its volunteers and participants. So thank you all for giving up a Tuesday night to come along and listen to me, and hopefully it'll be worthwhile. There's a little bit of feeling like you're teaching your granny to suck eggs with some of this. So some of this I will go through at pace. This is a presentation that I would often do within businesses and other organizations around some of the history around LGBTQI plus civil rights movement, some of the key legislative achievements, how they were achieved and what that means for the future as well. So I'll kick straight into it. So who are we? The Rainbow Project is a health and wellbeing organisation based here in Northern Ireland. We have centres in Belfast and in Foyle, and we've just recently opened a new outreach centre on Union Street, right in the queer quarter of Belfast. We provide services and advocate on behalf of LGBTQI plus people across Northern Ireland and in a range of different ways, which I'll talk about in a wee second. So a little bit about us. We receive at the minute about 120 referrals per month. So that's 120 individual clients engaging with the Rainbow Project on a monthly basis. Some of the services that we provide include trans and non-binary support. We have for example, our trans-only swimming event. We have our BU support group, and then we have a wider health advocacy support program in place for trans and non-binary people. We were founded as a sexual health organization. In those days, really, the Rainbow Project only worked with gay and bisexual men, but over our almost 30-year history, we've developed into an LGBTQI plus inclusive organization in terms of the services and what we advocate for. But we still provide a wide range of sexual health support and services, primarily again bisexual men, because they're the most at-risk community in terms of sexual ill health, but also to trans and non-binary people and anyone who has presented with risk. So if, for example, a cisgender heterosexual person presents to us with a substantial risk or indeed a substantial concern around HIV where it's impacting their emotional health and well-being, we will test those individuals for their benefit. We also have Northern Ireland's only dedicated LGBTQI plus co-cultural counselling service. That's a big way of saying that all of our counsellors identify as LGBTQI plus, and they only work with clients who are either LGBTQI plus or who are questioning their sexual orientation or gender identity. We actually have an additional counselling service, which we've been able to develop through the Mental Health Support Fund, which is for the parents of and families of LGBTQI plus people, which works in partnership with our Family Ties programme. Family Ties is a project we've been running for about 20 years, and it's around supporting families who are struggling to come to terms with their child's sexual orientation or gender identity, or who are experiencing other pressures related to family members and being LGBTQI plus. And Joe here from the History Project had previously been involved in developing the Family Ties project, and thank you for all your work in that, Joe. It's one of those interesting projects where a lot of those families, they don't necessarily want to come in and speak to someone like me, a well-affirmed queer person. They often want to speak to someone who knows what it's like to be them, who knows what it's like to have the feelings and experiences that they have. Parents have the right to their feelings, but exposing their children, or indeed exposing wider family members to those feelings and opinions, can have a negative impact on relationships and on the well-being of everyone involved. So through Family Ties, what we try and do as much as possible is engage families with other families so that they can talk to other people who know what it's like to be them, rather than to be presented with a well-affirmed queer person. We also run BAME support through our gay and ethnic group, or GAG as it's called. I didn't name that, unfortunately, but that's what it's become known as. And the gay group has recently had a substantial time investment with Shoher, our new member of staff, who is developing and working in that project with the support of SSE Electricity. And Shoher herself has a refugee experience, refugee background. We also provide advocacy support for hate crime and housing. Any LGBTQI plus person who experiences homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic hate crime in Northern Ireland gets offered the services of the Rainbow Project, and they can choose whether or not to access those. But we also support victims of hate crimes who don't want to go to the police, who don't want to make a direct report, and we can support them in third-party reporting as well. And as many of you will know, experiences of hate crime, we often think of hate crime as something that happens in public and in town and city centres, when in reality, the vast majority of hate crime is experienced at people's homes and experienced within their communities, and therefore has a substantial onward impact in terms of housing and homelessness. And also strategic lobbying and campaign work. Interestingly, the last bullet point is probably what we're known most for, our campaigns around equal marriage, around the blood ban, around support for trans and non-binary people and trans healthcare, when in reality, it's probably the smallest part of what we do. Certainly, heterosexual cisgender communities would know us most for that work, whereas primarily we are a service delivery organisation. We're very dedicated to partnership working and seek to work in partnership as often as possible. Some examples of those are listed. The Hate Crime Advocacy Service, which is led by Victim Support and also involves ourselves, Migrant Centre and Leonard Cheshire. The LGBTQI plus Mental Health Service, which is a partnership with Here and I, which was launched last June. The RSE program, which we've been delivering now for 8 years in partnership with Nexus, the sexual violence charity, and Relate, the relationship charity. We've been working with partners across the LGBTQI plus sector in the development of the Assembly All-Party Group on LGBTQI plus equality, and really pleased to say that all but one political party has signed up to that all-party working group. We just need an assembly to work it. And also the ban conversion therapy campaigns across Northern Ireland, working in partnership with the LGBT sector and human rights organisations, working across Ireland with our partners in the south, and indeed working across the UK to try and ensure that there's an effective ban on conversion therapy right across these islands, and that there's no border which someone can pass which would make conversion therapy legal. So I'm going to kick off a little bit of ancient history. I think it's important to frame this discussion in terms of the length and breadth of human existence. And the first point to note is that LGBTQI plus people have always existed. There's no point in time in which there have not been LGBTQI plus people. And we can see that represented through Native American culture, for example, in terms of ancient China with stories and fables, right back to, you can see the dates, I'm not going to read all those out. In terms of Greece and the Sacred Band of Thieves, again, if you're interested in that, you can do a little bit more research afterwards. In Egypt, King Pepe II. In India, we see from Hindu texts and throughout the Kama Sutra. In Rome, there's just too much to mention in terms of a celebration of gender diversity and same-sex attraction. And indeed, condemnation of same-sex relationships particularly came under attack with the spread of Christianity. We're going to start talking about criminalization because I think it's an important part of the journey here in Northern Ireland, and certainly where the journey we're going to go on tonight will start. And I think it's important that we understand how criminalization was introduced and where that has changed, and how we reflect upon particularly the part of the world that we live in and how we view our journey towards LGBTQI plus equality, and where we fall in terms of the best and the worst, the earliest and the latest. So what we know from criminalization, we can see around 1290, the introduction of ecclesiastical law, making being gay punishable by being buried alive or burnt to death. We see that revised by Henry VIII in 1533 to just being punishable by death. The French Penal Code and the Napoleonic Code, the Indian Penal Code in 1860, and you can see the countries that impacted. We can see the removal of the death penalty in the UK in 1861 after the passage of the Offence Against the Person Act, but that also changed to no longer require a witness to the supposed offence, and indeed it was after this where Oscar Wilde was criminalised. In 1901, the Queensland Criminal Code for Papua New Guinea, Nigeria, Kenya, etc. And 1921, criminalisation of women was considered. As you probably know, it has never been unlawful within the UK or Ireland for women to engage in same-sex relationships, certainly not in a written down law. It was only ever in relation to men. Other aspects of criminalisation that maybe aren't included are the Nazi war, particularly against gay men, but also wider gender diverse people. And you can see the stories of the men with the pink triangle, and as well, a really important point to note is that after the liberation of the camps, where most people were released and able to go home, many gay and bisexual men and wider gender diverse people went straight from concentration camps and work camps into prisons and prison camps because it was still unlawful to be gay. And then we can see in post-World War II a significant rise in arrests and prosecutions, including the prosecution of Alan Turing. If there's anything there that really jumped out at you as interesting, please have me back. Really happy to talk through any of it. But tonight we're going to focus on Northern Ireland. So looking at decriminalisation, I'm not going to read all of this out, it's there on the screen in front of you, but you can see the history of decriminalisation, where it started, where different parts of the world actually changed the law, where we saw we saw changes to the law being introduced. And you can see the United Kingdom, or England and Wales at least, here in 1967, and we can see going right back to 1863, the early 1900s, we can see an awful lot of countries moving towards decriminalisation a lot earlier than the United Kingdom, although often when we hear this talked about, we hear of the United Kingdom being presented as a country that was really on the curve of LGBT equality quite early. Screen's not working now. What's the worldview today? Well, 67 states continue to criminalize same-sex consensual activity. 11 have the death penalty. 34 UN member states have effectively enforced such criminalizing laws over the last 5 years, and 6 UN states currently have the death penalty. 36 out of 53 Commonwealth states currently have laws that criminalize same-sex consensual activity. Proliferation of LGBT-free zones in Poland and Indonesia. We have seen substantial changes, particularly in the United States, around drag performances and around LGBT or trans and non-binary people and wider gender diverse people, limiting their freedoms and particularly limiting the access to healthcare for trans and non-binary people in certain states of the United States as well. So we can't think of criminalization as something that has entirely gone away, or indeed something that has even disappeared from the Western world. It's something that we continue to see, and to my mind, something that continues to be a risk for LGBTQI plus people. So that's where we're going to start off our journey in Northern Ireland. I'm sure you have probably heard from Jeff at some point in terms of the case that he took and the work done by NIGRA and those early activists around the decriminalisation. So the Dudgeon versus United Kingdom case in 1981 found that Northern Ireland's law criminalising same-sex acts between consenting adults was a violation of the European Convention on Human Rights. This was the first case on the issue of decriminalisation, also led and provided the framework for the case by the Republic of Ireland in 88 and by Cyprus in 93. And interesting factoid, Mary McAleese was one of the first legal advisors on the case in the Republic of Ireland, the former president of Ireland, and recipient of the Tolerantia Award. Decriminalisation, the actual decriminalisation in Northern Ireland occurred in 1982, but this case had really far-reaching wide implications, particularly here in Europe, resulting in a prerequisite for memberships to apply for EU membership. And this had a big impact on the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Bloc in terms of the 1990s, and moves towards decriminalisation as a requirement in terms of application with the EU. During that time, we had the Save Ulster from Sodomy campaign. You can see there the late Dr. Ian Paisley, linked particularly to the Free Presbyterian Church and the DUP, among others, running advertisements in newspapers warning that decriminalisation could only bring down God's curse upon our people, and like I say, Ian Paisley as a notable leader. So this is what I really wanted to talk about tonight, was really the journey that we've been on and where we remain in terms of LGBT equality. So you can see there, as we talked about, 1982, we had decriminalisation of same-sex relationships. And in 1991, we had our first Belfast Pride Parade. Some people in the room tonight were participants, I believe, in that parade. And a really amazing, brave thing to do. Then in 1998, and really between 82 and 98, there were no substantial legislative changes towards equality for LGBTQI plus people. And again, it's easy to reflect that as only being a Northern Ireland problem, but there weren't any substantial moves in terms of England, Scotland, or Wales, or indeed the Republic of Ireland during that time. What we did have was Section 28 and the campaigns against that, and the moves by Thatcher and others in terms of limiting the ability of public service providers, in particular schools, to talk about same-sex attracted people. But you really didn't see any substantial legislative moves during that time. In 1998, with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, we saw the introduction of Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act, a very important document for a huge number of reasons, and we're obviously hitting the 25-year anniversary of that. But one of the key things within the Good Friday Agreement, which I think many people were very surprised to see, and certainly history would suggest that the Women's Coalition played a substantial role in ensuring that Section 75 included requirements to promote equality of opportunity across 9 separate grounds, one of which was among people of different sexual orientations. And that really was the first, in effect, equality legislation for LGBTQI plus people that was introduced in Northern Ireland. Decriminalisation, I mean, it's really leveling the field, if even, you know, I don't view it as equality legislation. It's the removal of something rather than the introduction of something. So in 1998, we saw that. Now, what that did was put a statutory requirement on all public authorities to promote equality of opportunity across 9 grounds, which included sexual orientation. How effective and how good that has been is an interesting question that we could talk about all night. But certainly has not provided the protection, support, or visibility that we see under the Equality Act that was introduced in England, Scotland, and Wales, but unfortunately not here in Northern Ireland. In 2000, we had the age of consent being brought to the same age for same-sex activity as well as heterosexual activity as well. So we had the evening up of the age of consent, whereas before that, I believe it was still 17 at that point, possibly 18, I can't remember exactly, in terms of the age of consent for same-sex activity compared to 16 for heterosexual activity. In 2003, we saw the introduction of employment protections. This was basically the first time in law where it was written down to be unlawful to sack someone because they were a lesbian, gay, or bisexual person, let's say. yeah, that was introduced in 2003, a substantial protection for LGBTQI plus people. And when we look through sort of the history of this, we can also see alongside it why LGBTQI plus people have become more visible, why our campaign for equality had become so much stronger. In 82, with the removal of criminalization, it meant that people could be more open about their sexual orientation in a way that they couldn't before, because they didn't face criminalization. Now, obviously, they still faced substantial discrimination because of their same-sex attraction, but the removal of criminalization meant that people felt safer and people could be more visible than they could be before. In 2003, with the introduction of the employment protections, what that meant was people slowly but surely started to come out more within the workplaces. Now, those numbers are still much lower than they should be, but we're seeing increasing numbers of people continuously being open in the workplace, and being open about their sexual orientation and their relationships, etc. So with the introduction of those employment protections, it meant that people could really start bringing their whole selves to work, and we could start increasing the visibility of LGBTQI plus people within workplaces. In 2004, we had the introduction of hate crime legislation. Again, this was right across the United Kingdom. And what this meant was that an additional sentence could be allocated by a judge if someone has committed a crime motivated by hatred across 5 different grounds, one of which is homophobia. Again, a substantial piece of legislation recognizing the inequalities, the violence, and the risk experienced by LGBTQI plus people across the United Kingdom. Again, its effectiveness is certainly something that could be questioned. To my knowledge, in Northern Ireland, there has never been a conviction where a additional sentence has been allocated by a judge on the basis of a hate motivated crime. And there is, in effect, no such thing as a hate crime. You can't be charged with a hate crime. You can be charged for a crime that's motivated by hate, if that makes sense. So the crime itself must be something that already exists in statute, for example. Like criminal violence, like criminal damage, harassment, stalking, things like that. And even stalking's only recently been outlawed as well. In 2004, we also had the introduction of the Gender Recognition Act, meaning that trans and non-binary people, well, trans people at least, could finally have recognition of their actual gender in terms of their birth certificates, in terms of their license and other materials. Again, we could ask a lot of questions about how effective the Gender Recognition Act has been, and particularly listening to trans people who had a desire to apply for a gender recognition certificate, but have found the process much too difficult, much too complicated, and far too expensive to actually continue through with that process. In 2005, we had the introduction of civil partnerships. Northern Ireland was the first part of the United Kingdom to have that legislation passed. I don't think it was anything by design, it was just by chance. But that meant that the first ever civil partnerships in the United Kingdom occurred here in Belfast with 2 wonderful couples, Shannon and Grania, and Christopher and Henry. Again, 2 really brave couples who had to deal with substantial amounts of media attention and media presence during their civil partnership days, but really done amazing representation of the community, and not just here in Northern Ireland, right across the United Kingdom, and continue to do so today. And again, this provided a really important moment and change for LGBTQI plus people. The ability to stand with your partner in front of your family and friends, to make a lifelong commitment, to engage in something that LGBTQI plus people for too long had viewed our families, our friends, our colleagues, all engaging in, that wasn't available for us. And simply to expose our families, our communities, our friends to same-sex couples, for them to see, to a same-sex couple standing in front of them, celebrating their love together, even kissing each other, which I imagine many people who've been in civil partnerships had never actually seen a same-sex couple kiss in real life before. All of these things had a huge impact on increasing that visibility for LGBTQI plus people. And I often explain it to people like this, in terms of the importance of visibility and the importance of knowing and understanding communities. If you'd said to my mum 20 years ago that gay men were dangerous and had a negative impact in society, she may have agreed with you. If you said that to my mum today, you'd get a slap across the face, because you're talking about her son. It's something that isn't an unknown concept to her anymore. It's something that she can humanize down to a very specific level and to her son. And with that level of visibility, that level of accessibility of these identities, how can people not realize that hatred or opposition to us is based on nothing other than prejudice and hatred? In 2006, we had the introduction of the Goods, Facilities and Services regulations. And these regulations basically meant that it was unlawful to refuse service to someone on the basis of their sexual orientation. Many of you will be aware of the Ashers case, which was a case taken under these regulations. And what that means is that if you're a same-sex couple walking into a hotel, they can't refuse to give you a room for the night. That is unlawful. An insurance provider can't refuse to sell insurance to a same-sex couple, or a mortgage provider can't refuse to give us a mortgage, or a landlord can't refuse to rent to us all on the basis of our sexual orientation. So again, an important protection in law for LGBT, well, at least lesbian, gay and bisexual people. Its impact for wider community is something, again, that could be widely debated. In 2013, then, we had the change to the adoption rules. This was the result of a lot of activism across the LGBTQI plus sector. Up until that point, it had been, it was only possible for a heterosexual married couple or an individual to apply to be an adoptive parent. What that meant was, if you were an unmarried heterosexual couple, you were not allowed to apply jointly to be an adoptive parent. Or a same-sex couple, and at this point we were unable to get married, but even if we were in a civil partnership, we were not allowed to even apply to be an adoptive parent. So this work was very much not about the right to be an adoptive parent, but the right to be considered alongside other possible applicants. This was a very long, drawn-out process. This is something that was heavily opposed by the then Ministers for Health who were responsible. It was Edwin Poots and Jim Wells, both of which had held the ministry during this period, and they refused to change the regulations to allow for same-sex couples and unmarried heterosexual couples to apply to be adoptive parents. Now, the interesting thing about the regulations before, the rules before, were that I, as a single gay man, could have applied to be an adoptive parent. But as soon as I tried to do that with a partner, it became unlawful. Jumping forward again then to 2016, this really was the first substantial move by the Northern Ireland Assembly around LGBT equality issues. And it was a decision taken by Claire Sugden, who was then Justice Minister, and thankfully wasn't opposed by anyone else within the executive, to extend the pardons legislation, or the Turing Law as it's become known, to Northern Ireland, meaning if you have been criminalised for something that would no longer be criminal, i.e. two men engaging in consensual sex with each other, that you could have your record expunged. And for anyone who had passed away, that happened automatically, posthumously, but if you were still alive, you had to apply for that. Again, its effectiveness, well, we've had 0 successful applications in Northern Ireland to the Pardons Bill. It was an important thing to do, an important thing to say, an important thing to get cross-party support on. However, its impact on those criminalized throughout our history has been very minimal, and there remains issues around age of consent as well. Whereas the act itself would have been no longer criminal if you, in terms of ages, if you were, for example, a 20-year-old having sex with a 16-year-old, that wouldn't be expunged. That wasn't included within the legislation. So a couple of important things to note here in terms of how did we get here. If you look at the kind of color code there, you can see red. We have the Good Friday Agreement, which isn't really the Assembly, but it's the Northern Ireland Act, so it's close enough, and the pardons for historic convictions. I guess there's an additional one there for 2022, which is the removal of the lifetime ban on gay and bisexual men donating blood, would be another red that was introduced by Robin Swan. Pleased to say, I was one of the first gay and bisexual men in Northern Ireland to be able to donate blood, and I have a big bruise on my arm from donating blood again yesterday. But those three items really were the only actions taken by the Northern Ireland Assembly towards LGBTQI plus equality. Everything that we see in green, the age of consent, employment protections, hate crime legislation, Gender Recognition Act, civil partnerships, and the GFS regulations, all of that legislation was passed during the Blair years and by the Labour government. At the same time, because the Northern Ireland Assembly had fallen throughout various parts of this, there was in place a shadow assembly, which continued to meet, which continued to debate, but couldn't take decisions and couldn't pass legislation. On each of these measures, when they were debated in the Northern Ireland Assembly, every one of them was opposed. And had it been left to the Northern Ireland Assembly, none of this legislation would have passed at this time. One of the interesting things in terms of how Northern Ireland has changed is that the vast majority of this legislation was opposed by the Ulster Unionist Party, and in fact by practically all, if not all, unionists within the Northern Ireland Assembly. But we look today to where the Ulster Unionists are, and that they are in many ways leading the charge for the ban of conversion therapy in Northern Ireland, certainly alongside other politicians. The substantial journey that the Ulster Unionists have been on, and I think it's an important note for us all, that there's no political party, that there's no politician that really can't be taken on this journey with us. The more modern regulations, equal marriage, I'm pretty sure I have slides on that in a few minutes to talk through in a little bit more detail. But that was brought in, again, I would say that was forced through Westminster rather than a decision that Westminster took. With a little bit of hoodwinkery, we were able to get that passed in Westminster and get equal marriage achieved. The final thing then is legal action, decriminalisation, we've talked about, but also the change to the adoption regulations were written in by a judge. This was not a decision taken by a minister or by the Northern Ireland Assembly. And the decision that we saw in 2021 after a threatened legal case against the South Eastern Health and Social Care Trust around the provision of materials to same-sex attracted prisoners, including safer sex materials and information, the case was dropped by the Health and Social Care Trust, and they agreed to implement changes within the prison system for LGBT prisoners. So it's kind of legal action, but legal action that was successful without being successful, if that makes sense. I just want to quickly touch on a couple of these, some of the big campaigns and some of the key achievements across those, and some of the journey that we were on. So in 1981, we saw the introduction of the lifetime ban for what's called MSM, men who have sex with men. And that's the basis on which the law was introduced. And what that meant was, if you were a man who had ever had sex with another man, you were banned from giving blood for the rest of your life. That's where the rule was. Didn't matter if it was 100 times or 1 time. If you'd ever had sex with another man, you were banned from being able to donate blood. Why was that introduced? Well, it was introduced in the early years of the HIV and AIDS crisis, where HIV was a new infection that we didn't fully understand. and to try and prevent risk in terms of the end user of our blood supply, which always has to be the number one criteria in terms of decisions around the management of blood, tissues, and organs. So it was the right thing to do when it was done. It was the right approach. While it didn't save everybody, and there were a number of people across the United Kingdom who had contracted diseases such as HIV, hepatitis, and others through being the recipient of a blood donation. I've been working on the blood ban since before I joined the Rainbow Project, so I'd say easily 18 years now. And across those 18 years, our call has always been the same. It was never for simply the removal of the blood ban. It was only ever about using the most up-to-date medical and scientific evidence to ensure that decisions were being informed by that evidence and not by prejudice. And for many years, my work in this campaign led me to believe that the deferral model that was in place, the lifetime deferral for gay and bisexual men, was having more harm on the blood supply chain than it was having benefits. So after many years of campaigning and no one really paying any attention, we finally got some move within SABTO. And SABTO is the committee with responsibility for the management of blood, tissue, and organs in the United Kingdom. And their review work had identified that a 1-year deferral model, so basically if you have had sex with a man in the last year, you can't donate blood. If that was more than a year ago, you could donate blood. That change was actually as safe as the lifetime deferral model. And that was introduced in England, Scotland, and Wales in 2011. But like the issue around adoption, the move was opposed by then DUP Health Minister Edwin Poots. Now, there was a number of court challenges by individuals who wanted to donate blood. There was also a case taken by the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. And the early rulings stated that the minister's decision had been infected by inherent bias, was the specific language used by the judge. But unfortunately, that ruling was not upheld in future cases and ultimately led to a ruling that the minister's decision was lawful. We finally saw the initial removal of the lifetime ban by Sinn Féin Health Minister Michelle O'Neill, and that was reduced to a 1-year deferral period in 2016, so 5 years after England, Scotland, and Wales. In her second day in office as Health Minister, Michelle O'Neill from the Rainbow Project offices announced alongside me that change would be made immediately. Now, that didn't make a massive change in the number of people who were able to donate blood, but importantly, it provided an opportunity for SABTO to continue their work to identify what the safest approach was in terms of managing possible blood donors. So in 2017, England, Scotland, and Wales reduced their deferral period further to 3 months. Meaning that if you hadn't had sex with another man in the last 3 months, you would be able to donate blood. If it had been within the last 3 months, you couldn't. Again, another important change. However, for someone like me, who's a gay man, who's married gay men have less sex than unmarried gay men, but we still have sex, that I'd be required to abstain from sexual relationships with my husband for 3 months to be able to donate blood. Some people may be motivated to do that. There may be moments in your life, a loss or some reason why you dedicate yourself to donating blood. But in a reasonable approach to ensuring a good blood supply, it really wasn't going to make much impact. But again, provided the right environment for SABTO to continue their important work. Unfortunately, that didn't occur in Northern Ireland. At that time, we didn't have a Northern Ireland Assembly. But in 2020, when the Assembly returned, it was reduced to 3 months by then Health Minister Robin Swann. And finally, in 2021, when SABTO introduced a new model called the FAIR system, which stands for the Assessment of Individualised Risk, that was introduced in 2020 in England, Scotland, and Wales, and introduced in 2021 in Northern Ireland. And part of the hold up in its introduction was for the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service to have the capacity to be able to carry out the training and development work they needed. So the new FAIR system, I don't have a slide on it, there's some nice pictures for you to look at. The FAIR system stands for the assessment of individualized risk. And rather than making decisions on the basis of identity, every single person gets asked the same questions. So one of the questions is, have you changed sexual partners in the past 3 months? If so, have you had anal sex with that partner? If the answer to both of those questions are yes, you will be deferred for giving blood for another 3 months. But that question isn't just asked of gay and bisexual men, it's asked of every single person who goes to donate blood. There are a couple of other restrictions in place, such as you can't be on PrEP, you can't have recently taken PEP either to be able to donate blood. But for the vast majority of reasons and on the basis of very sound medical advice and medical evidence, that we now have in place legislation or regulation which ensures that gay and bisexual men, myself included, are able to donate blood and a removal of the blood ban in every meaningful way. The campaign for equal marriage, I'll quickly touch on as well. So we saw equal marriage introduced in 2015 in the Republic of Ireland following the Yes Equality campaign. In 2015, we held the first rally for marriage equality organised by the Rainbow Project, Amnesty International and the Irish Congress for Trade Unions, in which 20,000 people attended, a really huge turnout. I remember standing on the stage because we had led the parade and just watching more and more people coming around Royal Avenue, this never stopping sea of people, which really was the kickoff point for the substantial leg of the equal marriage campaign. In 2014, equal marriage had been fully introduced in England and Wales. Now, in Northern Ireland, equal marriage had been debated 5 separate times by the Northern Ireland Assembly. And in, how do you explain it? So, all of those times, the DUP had tabled a petition of concern. What the petition of concern is, for anyone who doesn't know, it requires 30 MLAs to sign it. And it requires, when a petition has been tabled successfully, any vote to be carried out on a cross-community basis, meaning the majority of nationalists and the majority of unionists must vote in support of it for it to pass. At this time, the DUP had, I think, 34 MLAs. So they were able to table a petition of concern on their own without the support of any other party. And they accounted for more than half of the unionist bloc, meaning in effect they had a veto that they could use on any issue. And 5 times they tabled it against the motions calling for the introduction of equal marriage. Now, also in 4 out of 5 of those votes, we lost a straight up-down count. We lost. We didn't get a majority vote. But on the 5th time we did, we got a majority of 1 in the Assembly, which meant the Assembly had voted in support of equal marriage. At that point, our work in the Assembly in terms of motions was over. There was no point in repeating that exercise because it wasn't going to affect the sort of change that we needed to see. The Love Equality campaign officially launched in 2015, a collaboration between the Rainbow Project, Car Friend, Here and I, Amnesty International, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, and NUS-USI, the student union movement. Oh, that's all there. So there were 3 main strands of the campaign when we kicked off. The first of those was hearts and minds. We had to bring people with us. We saw the substantial achievements that were made in the Republic, not just in changing the law, but in changing society. We all looked on with awe at the substantial change that was being affected, the voices we were hearing supporting equal marriage, the families, the grandparents, the Come Home to Vote campaign, the huge momentous change that was happening on the other side of the border. And we really wanted to achieve as much of that as we could in Northern Ireland. But we also understood that our journey to success wasn't going to be as succinct and wasn't as clear. So when it comes to a referendum campaign, you know you have whatever, let's say 6 months to throw everything you have at a campaign. And at the end of that, you're either going to win or lose, but it would be over. For us, we were looking down the barrel of 10 plus years. We didn't know how this was going to be achieved. And we had to be very considerate of possible burnout, fatigue, and loss of interest, both within our community and beyond as well. So Hearts and Minds, trying to win people over, trying to bring people with us, trying to achieve similar to what they achieved in the South, not just a change in legislation, but actually changing the world that we live in, excuse me, and how LGBTQI plus people were viewed within that world. We've done a range of different things. A big part of it was around profiling same-sex couples, to talk about their stories, to talk about their experiences, to talk about their aspirations, and to ensure that as widely as possible, the important role that LGBTQI plus people play within our society was understood and celebrated. And some of you may have seen at Culture Night, for example, we had the big fat gay weddings a number of times. Gemma Hutton and her partner Stacey took part in those, as well as a range of other people. And a lot of people went out there and told their stories. The second part of that was the legal challenges. So there were 2 active legal challenges. One was by Grania and Shannon and Henry and Christopher, who had the first civil partnerships. And their legal challenge was around the right to marry in Northern Ireland. There was a second legal challenge by an unnamed couple from Northern Ireland who got married in, England. That's a good ring. Who got married in England and were seeking recognition of their marriage in Northern Ireland. It's a very interesting argument, something we saw a lot around the United States. And indeed, the question that ultimately led to the 50-state introduction of equal marriage was this question: how can you be married in one part of the United Kingdom or the United States, but not be married in another? Unfortunately, neither of those cases got to full conclusion by the time that equal marriage had been achieved. And then the third strand was Westminster and the Northern Ireland Assembly. So while the Northern Ireland Assembly was active, we worked very closely with representatives across the different parties, the SDLP, Sinn Féin, the Ulster Unionists, the Greens, People Before Profit and Alliance. And we worked collectively to develop a private members bill, a draft bill for the introduction of equal marriage in Northern Ireland. And we had many substantial legal heads who helped us develop that. What we also wanted to remove was this desire by all of the political parties to be the party that owned the issue of equal marriage, the party who had their name on the legislation, who would be celebrated for introducing equal marriage. And we were very much of the mindset that the only people to be celebrated for the introduction of equal marriage was the LGBTQI plus community. So we worked very closely with those politicians and parties. What we ultimately agreed was a collective approach to ensure that there wasn't one person who would have their name on this legislation, that we would seek to have everybody celebrated together and talking together about the importance of equal marriage and about them working in partnership across the Assembly to achieve this. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to private members' bills, they have to go in under one person's name. And we tried to get agreement across the political parties on who that would be, which we didn't achieve. So we ultimately picked names out of a hat, and that's who we decided whose name it was going to go under. But unfortunately, the Assembly collapsed very shortly after that and did not return before equal marriage was achieved. Some of the other work that we had done, I'll talk about Westminster in a wee second. We did a lot of work with charities. We had the Children's Sector for Love Equality campaign, where Bernardo's and a range of other Children's Law Centre and a range of others come out and spoke in support of equal marriage and why it was an important issue for young people. We had trade unions for love equality, who again talked about the importance of this for communities, for workers, etc. We had businesses for love equality as well. Big companies like Coca-Cola and Citi, and a huge number of them who supported that campaign. And indeed, wider community activity, getting people to sign petitions, getting people to write letters, getting people to come to protests and rallies. We had 4 marches for marriage equality, each attended by over 20,000 people. But throughout our campaign, we've been working to build relationships across the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And part of that was around the possibility of introducing private members' bills to the Commons and the Lords. So we had worked very closely with Lord Robert Hayward, and the bill that we had been working on for the Northern Ireland Assembly was taken by him to the Law Library and was ultimately amended and introduced in the House of Lords. So the bill that went through the Lords is, in effect, the bill that was written by Love Equality. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to the Commons and the Lords and private members' bills, it only takes one member to object at second reading for legislation to be dropped. And on every occasion that happened. We worked closely with Conor McGinn in the House of Commons as well from the Labour Party, who introduced the same bill into the Commons. But again, on second reading, it was opposed by one member and ultimately fell. But those relationships were important. What we had there was a Labour MP and a Tory peer working in partnership with us and in partnership with each other, seeking to achieve equal marriage with important roles within their individual parties. The two legal challenges we talked about. Ultimately, how equal marriage was achieved was with the support of Conor, with Lord Hayward, and particularly Stella Creasy. At that point, we had the Northern Ireland Assembly and Functions Bill. This was the legislation being brought forward that was supposed to mean that no one political party could pull down the Northern Ireland Assembly. You can see how successful that has been. The fact that we currently don't have an assembly that was pulled down by one party. But because it was Northern Ireland related, we believed it was Northern Ireland competent. And we believed that we could achieve amendments to this bill that could ultimately result in equal marriage being legislated for. But those relationships were important, particularly with the Conservative Party, because it led us to understand that a little bit of leeway would result in substantial change here. So, for example, what ended up in the bill was a 3-month deadline for the Assembly to return. And if it did return, that they would remain responsible for decisions around equal marriage. But if they didn't return within that 3-month period, that Westminster would move to introduce legislation on same-sex marriage and abortion for Northern Ireland. And with that, the support started to roll in. Despite having said up until the day of the vote that there was going to be a 3-line whip by the Conservative Party in opposition to any amendments to the bill, that was ultimately dropped. Members across the House were given a free vote in terms of the amendments to the Assembly Functions Bill, which led to overwhelming support for the amendments, their passage in the Northern Ireland Assembly Functions Bill, and ultimately the moves by Westminster to legislate for same-sex marriage in Northern Ireland, which led to the introduction of equal marriage in January 2020. The name of the first couple to get married jumped out of my head. But again, a truly wonderful, brave couple who allowed video cameras and news outlets to be present during their marriage, not for themselves, but for all of us. And then later in October 2022, we saw the introduction of legislation that would allow people who were already in civil partnerships to convert their civil partnerships to marriages. An important part of that legislation was ensuring that the date of the marriage was recorded as the original date of the civil partnership, not a new date, but recognizing that we had always been married when we choose to convert our civil partnerships to marriages. Some of the issues around the current fight for equality, this is not an exhaustive list by any means. Inclusion and celebration of LGBTQI plus people right across our society in all aspects of society. And unfortunately, what we've seen a lot in England over the last 5 years, and what we're seeing increasingly in Northern Ireland, is substantial transphobia and hatred and discrimination against trans and non-binary people. And we're also seeing substantial increases in homophobia and biphobia as well. Schools and education. I talked earlier about Section 75 and public authorities. Schools are the only public authority without responsibility under Section 75. They're the only body not responsible for promoting equality of opportunity across the 9 Section 75 grounds. So, the Northern Ireland Harbour Commissioner has more responsibility for promoting equality of opportunity around sexual orientation than individual schools have. Now, the authorities responsible for our education do have responsibilities around Section 75, but what we've seen from recent surveys and research is a dire experience by LGBTQI plus people within schools in Northern Ireland, where just under half of all LGBTQI plus kids don't feel safe within our schools. And school isn't somewhere where people choose to be, it's where we're required to be by law. And the least we can expect from our schools is that they are safe. Gender recognition reform. We have a border down this island in terms of gender recognition reform. And certainly within the Rainbow Project and the wider LGBT sector, we're seeking the introduction of self-ID legislation across this island and indeed across the United Kingdom and hopefully at some point across the world. We need to see substantial changes in trans healthcare, how that's delivered, how that's accessed, and the drivers that drive those responsible for healthcare for trans and non-binary people. At the minute, most people will be waiting 5+ years to get a first appointment with a gender identity clinic. It gets worse when you look at young adolescents, many of which will sit on waiting lists for adolescent services for 4 to 5 years before they age out of those services. And really, once you hit 17, you're not getting into those services. What we have and what we see within the Rainbow Project is many of our clients who spent years on an adolescent waiting list to age out and get moved into an adult waiting list where they join at the end and are looking down the barrel at another 5-year waiting list before ever getting to talk to a gender specialist in terms of their gender identity. The campaign to ban conversion therapy, it's very visible and very vocal at the minute. Most of you will be aware of that. And as we talked about at the start, the fact that there are still 67 countries where it is still illegal to be gay. And that's the end of the presentation. Hopefully there was something interesting in there for everybody, but very happy to answer any questions, have a chat, whatever you want to talk about.
Thank you so much, John. That was such a comprehensive overview of the history of the LGBTQIA plus civil rights campaigns over the past decade. So thank you so much for that. So comprehensive, such a great overview. You have spoken for so long. I don't want to keep you for too much longer, but you very kindly asked if anybody has any questions. Would anybody like to ask John a question or make a comment about the presentation? I think we have time for at least a couple of questions. Nigel.
Hello, folks. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. Thanks. Thank you as well, John. I thought that was a really good talk. Ever since the ban on blood donations had been mediated quite an awful lot, and it made it an awful lot more easier for blood donation to take place for gay and bisexual men. Not an awful lot of time has passed to see if there was any significant impact. Have you noticed yourself if there was any improvement on blood stocks here in Northern Ireland since that change in law had taken place?
Thanks, Nigel. Very interesting question. I normally prerequisite my answers with not everything has an answer, or I don't always know the answers, but I'll try and say something. There is no answer. Unfortunately, we still don't monitor for sexual orientation when it comes to blood donations. So disseminating that information is going to be very difficult. As I said, I was down giving blood yesterday, so I was chatting to a lot of people who I'd worked with around the introduction of the FAIR system, and they said certainly, they're seeing it, but they can't really measure it. One of the scariest things I've ever had to do was to walk into the blood supply room in the blood transfusion service here in Belfast, and I was expecting to see wall to wall of hanging blood bags. There was literally a 3-foot shelf of blood. And that was the blood supply that existed in Northern Ireland at that time. And one of the things about blood is it doesn't last for very long as well, as a very short shelf life. So volume matters, but consistency matters more than anything. And the numbers of people who donate blood are very, very low percentages. And if we can increase that in any meaningful way, particularly in regular donations, it will have a huge impact on the ongoing blood supply. So not to make this about me, but I'm not a very good blood group. I'm AB something, but my husband's O negative, which is like the most desirable blood group for blood donations. Him giving blood every 12 weeks, that one person alone has a very substantial impact on our blood supply. So numbers matter to some extent, but consistency matters more than anything when it comes to blood donations. And let's say 5% of all people give blood. If we can increase that with 5% of gay and bisexual men who never donated blood before, that will have a substantial impact on the long-term blood supply that we have in Northern Ireland. Your point about time is a really interesting one, an important one, because the change was introduced while we were still living COVID and still living restrictions. The photos there of that was World Blood Donor Day when I was back up with Robin Swan. But the first day I donated blood, all the photos are of me wearing a mask. We weren't allowed to take our masks off in the room while we were donating blood. So it's very hard to get the message out. And I think there's a big responsibility on many of us within the community to continue to share this message as much as possible, because I'm still regularly talking to people who previously wouldn't have been allowed to donate blood, who don't know that the regulations have changed and that they would now be able to. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but it's an answer anyway.
It does answer my question. There's limited information on the question, so there's nothing really you can do about it. We'll have to wait and monitor this for some more years yet to find out for sure.
Exactly.
Sarah and Alex, would you like to ask John a question or make a comment?
Yes, indeed. Can you hear us all right?
Yeah.
Yes. It's Alex. John, fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. Full of lots of great information. Curious if you have anything to say or can speak a little bit about the languaging of conversion therapy versus conversion practices. I know that I first encountered it at a protest in the Republic last year where they had changed the languaging to conversion practices, which I think is very valid because it's been proven that they're not therapies. The vast majority of them are harmful, and they don't fall in a therapeutic category at all. So just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely, and a good challenge to me. It's like I can't say anything but LGBTQI plus now because that's what my brain says. And in 20 years of campaigning against conversion therapy, that's what comes out of my mouth. But absolutely, conversion practices is the term that we should all be using and that I have to train my brain to say, because it's so much more than therapy. And in fact, many people around the room will remember this happening, the campaigns that we led, the protests that we held outside every single conversion therapy event that was held in Northern Ireland for years, outside churches, outside community centres, trying to send a message, particularly to those who were engaging in these practices, that there was a supported, loving community here waiting to embrace them, and that they didn't need to live their life by their internalized homophobia. But in very many ways, the therapy side of things, certainly from a professional perspective, should be non-existent or comes with a very substantial risk. Every single body with responsibility of management of counsellors, psychotherapists, psychologists, etc., have all basically outlawed conversion practices across the United Kingdom, and anyone found to be engaging in those practices will be struck off. And that's what we saw with Mike Davison, who is the leader of Core Issues Trust, which is the main conversion therapy advocacy organisation and previously delivery organisation in Northern Ireland. And when these concerns were brought to his governing body, he was struck off as a psychotherapist for that. So in terms of the therapy side of things, that's what we should be talking about less, because there are already substantial protections in place around that. It is the standing round people praying, telling them to talk in tongues, telling people to scream until they make themselves vomit in churches, praying around people that the demon will leave them. It is so many of these really dangerous, really harmful, often quite physical practices that don't fall into the the therapy heading. So I definitely agree. Practices is what we should be talking about. And what we need to ensure is that the legislation introduced talks about any practice that seeks to alter or change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity are the practices that should be banned.
Thank you. I haven't had a chance to ask the question, and I was just kind of curious if those organizations that are still doing it are really touting it as therapy, then I can see there's fighting their languaging as well as the practices. But yeah, thanks for that clarification.
Yeah, it's even, we often get this question, particularly from faith groups. So, you're trying to ban prayer. But prayer is such a broad term, and have an entire congregation calling out an individual for being LGBTQI plus and collectively praying for that person is not a positive thing. It is another version of conversion practices.
Yeah, John, it is Sarah here. From a personal experience, there's blackmail as well, because you're told if you don't submit to being prayed over or being anointed with oils, you're already answering only to Satan. So there's a lot of emotional in that, and certainly practices more than therapy there, because they say, oh, that's not therapy, that's our practice of praying over. So sometimes the changing the language can help people in that respect.
Absolutely.
I know I suffered a lot of blackmail.
Absolutely, and it's again so common. And again, it doesn't need to be out loud to be coercion. It doesn't need to be someone saying do this or else. Many people live this and live and know and hear their families talking about LGBTQI plus people. I've seen other people removed from their communities, removed from their faith groups, etc., for being an LGBTQI plus person. That sort of coercion alone can be enough to motivate someone to seek to change or alter their sexual orientation or gender identity. But the reality is and remains and will always remain that that's not something that can be achieved. It is snake oil. You cannot change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all your amazing work with the Rainbow Project.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll have two final questions, John, if that's okay. Firstly, Daniel, would you like to ask John something?
Hi, cheers. John, thanks very much. Really interesting talk. Thoroughly enjoyed it. My question is it's a bit more broad, I suppose, of an inquiry to yourself, but to anyone as well, really. I'm a master's student in the University of Galway, and I'm actually currently studying, doing research on Irish and Northern Irish LGBTQ plus history. There's a good amount written that I've come across anyway, done in the Republic, on the history of gay and lesbian activism and queer experience on this side of the border, but there's significantly less of it from what I've seen on the other side of the border in Northern Ireland, despite the fact that in many ways Northern Ireland was, like, as you brought out, like pioneering it for the whole island. So broadly, first of all, is there any resources or reading or anything at all you could direct me towards that you think would be very valuable in that? And secondly, more directly, is there any way I can sort of reach out to you to just talk a bit more about this, as it might be beneficial to my own research and possibly the research of others who are in similar field to me?
Sure. I would warn, I'm 39, although I look older, so my experience of history is limited. But certainly I'm very happy to reflect upon the stories that I know and can certainly put you in touch with people who are better informed than me on some of the history. Linhall Library is really good. NIGRA have been really good at maintaining records and building up that record base as well over recent years. And they would have been, Fidelma, correct me if I'm wrong, they would have been really one of the leading, certainly in terms of the legislative and decriminalization aspect of it. Carafriend have been doing a lot of work on their archive, and they're just hitting the 50-year point next year. So that'll take you right back into the 70s, the work that they've been doing as well. But really, pre-70s, you're getting beyond any knowledge base that I would have around activism by LGBTQI plus people, other than very, very individualized stories of some gender non-conforming people and some other queer people. But some of them are anecdotal, some of them are stories that I'm not sure have ever been written down.
Mary Ellen's put in Prony. Prony's been gathering a lot of information, pulling a lot of it together as well. So
yeah, so Prony, Linhall Library, I'm pretty confident now.
And our online archive.
Online archive, there you go. Mary Ellen beat me to it. I'm pretty sure they have an online archive, so they do. So Mary Ellen can give you a link to that as well, and that has a lot of the the early work towards decriminalization.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, but I just talking to me there about the links. I remember being at an event in Dublin Castle with Senator David Norris. It was one of the greatest moments of my life when he turned around to me and says, "You look and sound like a young me." I was like, God, that's a big thing to say. I'm not sure I'm as camp, but I love it. I love it anyway.
Mal, would you like to ask John something?
Yeah, I mean, I could have asked you tomorrow in the office. But I feel like, it's very easy to forget about just how much history has happened in such a short time in Northern Ireland, particularly with civil rights stuff. And I feel my question might be ever so slightly cheesy, but I feel like it's also important to acknowledge. So, like, if you could talk to your younger self, like, and tell them all these amazing pieces of legislation and work that's going to happen, what would you say? Thank you.
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I think I would say is go for it. Go for it. Get rid of all those negativities in your head, all those things that tell you you're not supposed to have a voice, you're not supposed to have an opinion, you're not supposed to talk about these things, and all of that. It wouldn't even be specifically LGBT related. It would motivate me in terms of my politics and my activism, which existed long before I joined the Rainbow Project, and that there are other people out there who are just like you, who are mouthy, who are troublemakers, but ultimately want to affect change in the world, and you can be one of those people. But I think your point about how much has been achieved, we can't talk about that enough, while also recognizing how fast everything can be lost. But there are people in the room who will know this better than me. But in my 15 years, when I started in Rainbow, there wasn't a door that we didn't have to knock down. There was nobody inviting us in for proactive engagements. Very, very few people. A couple of people in OFM, DFM who had responsibility for this. Few people within the Equality Commission, but and the trade union movement was also very good as well. But other than that, every single person we wanted to talk to, we were knocking down doors. A few of you work in the LGBT sector and you know what it's like today. It is a non-stop onslaught of people looking our time, looking to talk to us, looking to work with us, all of that. And that change alone shows the direction of travel is singular. And part of what we need to achieve as a sector is strength, unity, collaboration, singularity of purpose, because that's when we've achieved the most. When we stood together and fought relentlessly and with relentless positivity for equal marriage, we achieved more than the decades of infighting and difficulty that occurred within our sector. So there's no amount of change that we cannot achieve, but we will only achieve it together.
Thanks, John. I see Nigel. Do you have one final question for John? Yeah.
I'm aware that we're very pressed for time. I will ask my question. So, John, I'm going to ask you in as tight as a manner as you can, sum up, because the subject I'm talking about is education. So education is very important. So if schools are not bound to be responsible for sexual education, and therefore that also means LGBT plus education, what's the best means that you would think off the top of your head to help address that? So I take it that that's something to do with legislation in the long term, but I keep thinking about the little book that I got from my American crowd, which was the Queer Dictionary, just because it's a handy little resource for referencing on materials for anything to do with the LGBT community. But what do you think?
I thought you were going to ask me more broadly about schools there. Now John's going to get in my soapbox and we're going to be here for another half hour. On RSE education, I think what I've always thought, I've worked in sexual health as well as the LGBT sector. Rainbow's a sexual health organization for the last 15 years. And like so many things, we're never going to address this issue by focusing only on schools and kids. Because the vast majority of adults have no RSE education. They have absolutely no idea. Show a man a picture of a vagina and ask him to explain what it is and what the relevant names are of the different parts of a woman's anatomy. They are not capable of doing it. The madness I hear people talking about sex and sexual health, and even how babies are conceived. I mean, just mind-blowing stuff. So I think we need to take a societal-wide approach to education around sexual health, around relationships, around consent, around body positivity, around sex positivity as well. Sex is for many people, is an important part of life and an important part of our well-being as well. So I think we need to take an entirely new societal-based wide approach to sex positivity, and also informing people, because the best education you can get is from your parents, but your parents can only inform you if they themselves are informed. And there are a lot of people out there who think they know things when in the cold day of light, they realize they have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. So I don't think, like so many things, I don't think it's enough to focus on children and hope that by the time they become adults that the whole thing fixes itself, because we all know how we were influenced to understand about sex and relationships. And no matter how good your RSE education is, children will still be influenced by other children and will still be influenced by adults in terms of their understanding and beliefs around sex and relationships. So that's my opinion in a nutshell.
Thank you so much for being so generous with your time tonight, John. We know you're a busy man, and you probably have seen in the chat there's been some great comments. Marion said, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. And Brian Lacey has said, an excellent talk. Wonderful to have such a well-informed and articulate advocate for the community. And I'm sure we all appreciate so much what you've done in terms of your own leadership and your campaigning work over recent years. And we wish you so well for the next step after you step down as director. But I'm sure we'll all want to show our appreciation tonight to John. So thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone for coming along tonight. And I'll hand back to Joe.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's been amazing. I'm just going to stop the recording here.